Today, we're going to devote the whole period to the topic of Confucianism, which is a school of thought founded by Confucius, who devoted his whole life trying to promote harmony among differences over 2,500 years ago, or unity in diversity, which is the theme of the conference. Because of that, Confucianism is regarded by many scholars and philosophers, even Nobel laureates, as the key to unite people in the world. What is Confucianism? Why would so many so highly regard Confucianism? We are very fortunate to have one of the most, if not the most, appropriate and knowledgeable scholar in the world to answer the question for us. Professor Ames was first exposed to Chinese philosophies and fell in love with them at the age of 18 when he was an exchange student in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where I first met him. For over half a century, Professor Ames has been relentlessly studying and interpreting Chinese philosophies to the West. Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Hawaii, where he was the head of Center for Oriental Philosophies and currently Humanities Chair Professor at Peking University, Professor Ames has co-authored several interpretative studies of Chinese philosophy and culture with D.L. Hall, including Thinking Through Confucius, Anticipating China, Thinking from the Han, and Democracy of the Dead. He has also authored Confucian Role Ethics and translated many of the Chinese classics, including Sun Tzu, The Art of War, 孙子兵法, the Confucian Analects, and Dao De Jing, and many others. Professor Ames has most recently been engaged in compiling a new sourcebook in classical Confucian philosophy and in writing articles promoting a conversation between American pragmatism and Confucianism. So you can see from all this why I said Professor Ames is the most appropriate speaker for this topic. To save the time, we will not break up for discussions. If you have questions, please type them in the chat room. Professor Ames will talk about 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll devote the rest of the time to questions and answers. Now, Professor Ames.
Thank you, Ping Ping. Is my PowerPoint up?
Not yet.
Okay.
You should be able to share. You should be able to share. Use the screen now.
Can you just be sure that everybody can see it?
Let me.
Ernst? Right now, not.
Currently, okay. You can see from Ernst's wall, he actually magically put it above his head.
We don't have the beamer on this morning.
Oh, okay.
We're still waiting for a computer to come, an additional one.
Oh, okay.
We need for that, but yes,
all right.
Seeing it. Very
it's now good.
Now it's up.
It's off. Yes, go ahead.
Good. Let me first thank Fu Pingping for inviting me to be part of your conference. A humanistic management network is an inspiring idea. It's an enlightening idea. And the topic, unity in diversity, couldn't be more appropriate for the talk that I want to give today. The first question we want to ask is, what is Confucianism? And in order to address this question, I want to make the argument that we really have to let this tradition speak for itself, to have its own voice. We call it Confucianism. Confucianism is a term that was introduced by the second governor of Hong Kong in a book that he wrote in the middle of the 19th century called The Chinese, a General Description of the Empire of China and its Inhabitants. And so if instead of using the idea of Confucianism, we in fact use the Chinese language itself, Confucianism is Ru Xue. And Ru is not a, it's a social class, that the idea of Ru goes back 30 generations before Confucius to the Shang Dynasty, a dynasty that is renowned for the production of the bronzes that are in museums all around the world. These bronzes were created as part of a high civilization. The Shang Dynasty the comparison might be with the Greeks. If we go to Anyang, they have a museum called Wenzi Boguan. The Wenzi Boguan has the Museum of Writing. Museum of Writing. In the Shang Dynasty, on the Oracle Bones, you have a vocabulary of already 5,000 characters. An intellectual, an educated Chinese person today can read maybe 4,000, 4,500 characters, can write maybe 3,500, 4,000 characters. And so the vocabulary that you had at that time was already hugely sophisticated. This class of people called Ru were the people responsible for aestheticizing the human experience, that they created these bronzes as part of religious observances, as part of political observances, as part of architecture, as part of all of the different things that together constitute a high civilization. And the word Ru means something like gentle or mild. And it's very much like the English. In English, you talk about a gentlewoman or a gentleman. You talk about the gentry. Well, these were the lettered people, the literate people, who constituted a class and whose mission was really to elevate the human experience culturally into something that would transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. And so one of the terms that we'll be using a lot today is a term called Li. Li is often translated into English as ritual. You see the libations that you would pour from this bronze vessel that we're looking at. The project of Li was to establish a kind of social grammar, a social syntax, a way of being in the world where everybody had a place, and where from that place, they tried to achieve a kind of propriety in their roles and relationships. It's all about a grandfather and a granddaughter. It's all about a teacher and a student. It's all about a person and their ancestors. It's all about the intergenerational transmission of a living cultural tradition. And so this idea of Li is really, really fundamental to the mission of Confucianism, and that is the transformation of the human experience into something that is elegant, something that is cultured, something that is articulated, something that is moral, something that is educated. Now, the first appearance of the term itself, the difference that I'm trying to make is the difference between something like Marxism or Hegelianism or Christianity that is focused on the life of one person. I want to argue that this thing called Rujue, this class called Rujia, are the intellectuals in every generation who take on the responsibility of inheriting the culture, of understanding the culture as deeply as possible, as writing commentary and expanding upon the culture, as using the culture to address the pressing issues of the time, and then when their hair turns white, passing it on to the next generation and recommending to them that they do the same. And so we find ourselves in this time. Ping Ping mentioned that I've translated some of the Chinese classics, that these same classics that were defining of the Ru 2,500 years ago are the cultural core that is passed on in every generation. There's a contemporary Chinese philosopher, a very good friend of mine named Zhao Tingyang. And he's written several books asking the question, where did China come from? China is not a country. China has 300 million more people than all of Africa. China is 2 of Europe's, both Western and Eastern Europe combined. That China is a continent. And so how did this continent called China, if we think in terms of the population today, and we include the diaspora, China is 25–30% of the world's population. And so this tradition that has a single identity began with the Shang Dynasty, the Shang Dynasty that I've been talking about. And Zhao Tingyang talks about a centripetal whirlpool that early in the tradition, in the Shang Dynasty, a cultural identity was established that brought unity to diversity. That China at this time, you talk about the Zhongyuan, the central plains of China, in the Hebei kind of area, extending out from Hebei, that the diversity of the populations and languages and cultures in this area was the same as Europe. Like when we think of the diversity that is Europe. But what happened was these Ru established a cultural genealogy, a cultural lineage that people bought into, that different people competed for the rulership of the Central Plains. And all of these diverse people, all of these different kinds of people, the Italians and the Germans and the French and the British, all came together around this one identity that remembered a shared history in the cultural canons, in the canonical texts of China, in the classics of China. And so the first time that we see the term Ru is in the Analects of Confucius, about 500 BCE, where he says to his student, you don't want to be a small kind of a Ru. You want to be a Junzi Ru. You want to be an exemplary person Ru. You want to be an exemplary scholar, an exemplary Wenren, an exemplary literatus. Another passage that we get from the Analects is Shu'er Buzuo, that this tradition is hugely conservative, that this cultural tradition that is captured in the canons and the commentaries on the canons is something that has to be preserved from generation to generation. And so each generation inherits the tradition, but at the same time, each generation has the responsibility to build the connector to the next generation. That this is a living tradition, a hybridic tradition, a tradition that draws into itself the cultural resources that come in from the boundaries. And so this image that Zhao Tingyang uses of a centripetal whirlpool is really a very good image. We think about the Yuan dynasty, our Mongols. We think about the Qing dynasty, our Manchus. Well, this is how what is outside, what is outside comes inside. It's how this population, as diverse as Europe, as diverse as Africa, came together to constitute one political, cultural tradition. The next passage that we have from the Analects is the idea of 儒之和, 儒之和. It's a critical tradition, that being a morally competent human being is not an easy business. That one of the fundamental precepts of this Confucian tradition is that we have to have the moral imagination to look at another person, another family member, another member of the community, and ask the question, how should I behave in order to grow this relationship as robustly as possible? That morality in this tradition is not following the commandments of a transcendent God. It's not calculating goods. It's not a duty that one has to the categorical imperative. That morality in this tradition, quite simply stated, is to comport yourself in such a way that you grow the relationships that you have with other people. The project of personal cultivation is cultivating the meaning in meaningful relationships. And so when we ask the question, if you ask the question in an Abrahamic religion, where does meaning come from? Well, it comes from some kind of a Godhead. It comes from an external source of truth and beauty and goodness. But if we ask the question in this Confucian tradition, where does meaning come from? Meaning comes from the tradition as people have created meaning in their roles and relationships in this world. That this idea of Li, this idea of pursuing propriety in your roles and relationships, trying to grow your roles and relationships, is the source of meaning in the tradition. And so it's being a morally competent person is asking in every different situation, what should I do? What should I do? And finally, it is a progressive tradition. The Analects has this passage, 温故而知新, to review the old in order to innovate with the new. And so it's progressive in the sense that the cultural tradition itself is precious and has to be preserved. But at the same time, this tradition feeds an evolving, an evolutionary, a progressive tradition. And so if we take an example, Buddhism comes into China, the first wave of Western learning comes into China from South Asia. And over the next several centuries, transforms the intellectual culture of China. It transforms Confucianism. We can't talk about Neo-Confucianism of Wang Yangming or Zhu Xi without talking about Buddhism. But at the same time, this Confucian tradition produces its own Buddhism, the Chan Buddhism, the Sanlun Buddhism, the Huayan Buddhism. These are Asian versions of Buddhism that are rooted in South Asian Buddhism, but have taken on the kind of cosmology that is defining of this Confucian world. And I'm going to say something about that cosmology. So the Ru is really the intergenerational transmission and embodiment of a compounding cultural legacy within a complex network of family lineages closely aligned with the prime moral imperatives of the tradition. The governing metaphor of the tradition is family. That a country is not a country, it's a guojia, a country family. Human beings are not human beings are renjia, human family. If I was standing in front of you and I wanted to invite you to all stand up, speaking Chinese, I would say, Da jia qing jian qi lai. Big family, please stand up. The classroom is shifu or shimu, teach your father, teach your mother, and xue jie and xue di, a student older sister and student younger brother. That family is the governing metaphor of this tradition. The notion of li is centered on the idea of family. There's a great Shang Dynasty translator of Western philosophy, Western literature, named Yan Fu. He translated John Stuart Mill. He translated Aldous Huxley. He translated many of the most prominent Western scholars. But when Yan Fu looked back over 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history, he said, if you want to talk about effecting social and political order, it's 30% emperor and 70% jiazu, 70% family lineage. That people live their lives, the economy, the politics, the religiousness were family-centered undertakings. That a whole life was lived within this context of family. And so the core, the center of this tradition is this idea of family. And so you have this elite level, the people who are listening, who are part of our humanistic management network, are Ru on their own. They're people who are promoting humanism. That's the meaning of Ru. And so you have this elite group of people who take responsibility for the literate tradition, the transmission of the literate tradition, but then you have the people themselves become Ru. And they become Ru through this prime moral imperative called Xiao. And we translate it into English as filial piety. And then our students say, well, what does that mean? We translate it maybe best as family reverence because it has a religious aspect to it. But Xiao, the character for Xiao, if you look on the screen, the character for Lao is this old man. Everybody knows that wonderful picture of Einstein with his crazy hair. Well, the old man leaning on a cane is Lao on the oracle bones, a character that goes back to the Shang Dynasty in the 2nd millennium BCE. But this character is then combined with the character for youth, for child. And so when you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you have the character for Xiao. It's that same old person leaning on the next generation. And so this idea of Xiao, of family reverence, is the embodiment of the tradition as it's been passed on. When you look at a picture of your old grandfather or your great-grandfather, you can see a kind of physical similarity, a kind of genealogical similarity. Well, this notion of Xiao is the embodiment of the cultural tradition. It's the values. It is the texts. It is the technologies. It is the mores. It is the food and the music of the tradition. And so this idea of embodiment is hugely important in the way in which we think about rule, about what we call Confucianism. And so the classic of family reverence, the master said, your physical person with its hair and skin are received from your parents. Vigilance and not allowing anything to do injury to your person is where family reverence begins. And that's true, that the idea is that you inherit your body from the tradition, and you return your body to the tradition. But body is much more than simply hair and skin. That body is the conduit through which the cultural tradition is passed on from generation to generation. And so keeping your body intact is keeping the cultural tradition intact. It's a much more profound idea than simply protecting your physicality. So we're living in a world today where in one generation, we have seen a sea change in the economic and the political order of the world. And we've seen the rise of Asia broadly, but the rise of China in particular. And so what I really wanted to focus on today, and I hope can be part of our conversation, is what does this cultural tradition have to contribute to a changing world cultural order? I would make the argument that we live in the best of times, we live in the worst of times. We live in the best of times because this animal called the human being is magnificent. We have created a technology, a technological foundation that is so incredible that I could fairly argue that world hunger is no longer a problem. World hunger is no longer a problem. You don't have a problem if you have a solution, and the technologies that we have today are such that if we decided to do it, we could begin tomorrow to eradicate the problem of world hunger. And so it's not a technical issue, it's a moral issue. We don't have the ethical compass, we don't have the political will to rid the planet of this scourge called hunger. And so even though we live in the best of times, we also live in the worst of times. We have global warming, we have environmental degradation, we have food and water shortage, we have massive species extinction, we have income inequities such that 8 people in the world own half of the world's wealth. We have pandemic. We are living in a perfect storm. And what this predicament has in common, there are 4 things that we can associate with this perfect storm, with the worst of times. Number 1, these problems that add up to a predicament are organic. They're zero sum. You can't address food and water shortage without addressing world population issues. You can't address massive species extinction without talking about environmental degradation, and so on. All of these issues are interrelated. Secondly, the human being is complicit, that these issues are of a human making, that we're in there. Number 3, they don't have boundaries. A pandemic doesn't care if you're African, if you're Chinese, if you're American, it'll take your life. And fourthly, that we have, as a human species, the cultural resources to address this perfect storm. And so my argument today is not that Confucianism is going to save the world. My argument is that we need all of the cultural resources that we have in order to resolve the predicament that we are facing. And so I want to say why I think that Confucian culture has a contribution to make, a unique contribution to make. To begin with, the cosmology of this tradition, unlike the Greeks that give us ontology, the science of being, that promise us that there is something real and unchanging that we can know, that underlines there's a design to everything in the world and to the world itself, that ultimately becomes the Abrahamic concept of God. That instead of this ontology that we inherit from the classical Greeks, the science of being, there's a kind of, I created this term, zootology, the Shang Lun, the art of living. That in the Book of Changes, it has this beautiful passage that says, 天地之大德曰生, that the greatest capacity, the greatest virtuosity of the cosmos is the production of life. And 生生之谓义, that when we talk about change, we're talking about this ceaseless procreation. And so the starting point of this tradition is that you set the root and you grow the tradition. And so this Confucian intergenerational transmission of a thick living cultural tradition is a model of cultural change for the world. That when we think of this, the magnificent civilization of ancient Greece, and we think about the polity called Greece today, the connection is not so immediate. When we think of ancient Egypt and the grand civilizations of ancient Egypt on the Nile, and then we think of the country of Egypt today, when we think of Italy and the Romans, when we think of Iran and the Persians, that there is a kind of this model of cultural change that is passed on from generation to generation. The embodiment of it is really a model of cultural change in the sense that it is constantly absorbing into itself those things that would compete with it. So the second wave of Western learning after Buddhism comes in, the Jesuit tradition, and Western learning is absorbed into this Confucian tradition. Marxism, today phenomenology and pragmatism. When we talk about China's most prominent philosophers today, Li Ziho, for example, he's Kantian, he's Marxist, and he's Ru, he's a Confucian. All of these things together, if we talk about Mo Zhongshan, Kant and Confucianism, if we talk about Tang Juni, Hegel, Whitehead, Confucianism. And so this tradition is a living tradition that draws into itself, draws into the centripetal whirlpool, those elements from outside that would give it competition. It has a family-centered morality. The starting point of the Confucian tradition is a radical empiricism. It doesn't speculate about transcendent gods. It doesn't speculate about an immortal human soul. It begins from the everyday experience. It's all about the perennial issues that we deal with every day of our lives. It's about family, it's about teachers and students, it's about showing proper respect to those who have gone before. So it's a kind of family-centered morality that is based upon the idea of 中枢之道, putting yourself into the shoes of somebody else and then trying to cultivate the relationship with that person such that you grow that relationship. So as a cultural tradition, it produces something called a daotong. It produces a cultural center that is passed on from generation to generation that provides a huge population, a continent of people with a shared identity, with a sense of Chineseness. And so this tradition in many ways is the functional equivalent within Abrahamic traditions of the concept of God. Being Chinese and being part of this unfolding lineage, being part of a genealogy of culture is as important and is as deserving of reverence as an Abrahamic person would direct towards their God. And so the key texts give us this idea of the root of culture is the responsibility, the capacity and the responsibility for personal cultivation in one's roles and relationships. The starting point is that we don't live our lives inside our skins. We're not individuals, that discrete individuality, autonomy is a fiction, that there's no such thing, that everything that the human being does physically, intellectually, culturally, we do in association with other people, with our environment, with our natural environment, that everything that we do is transactional. And so that being the case, what are we going to do about those transactions? How are we going to grow those transactions in such a way that we can optimize the human experience? And so this idea of personal cultivation is the starting point. In the Confucian tradition, 修身齐家治国平天下, that out of this personal cultivation, we can seek to bring peace to the world. And so it has this conception of family and community that is based upon an achieved propriety in our roles and relations. A moment ago, I said that association is a fact. Everything that we do is transactional. That being the case, as soon as the word association is neutral, but as soon as I stipulate what kind of association is this? This is a husband and a wife. This is a teacher and a student. This is a neighbor and a neighbor. That as soon as I stipulate roles and relationships, they become normative. Are you a good husband? Are you a good teacher? Are you a good neighbor? And so this idea of roles and relationships being the center of this Confucian morality is fundamental. In the Han Dynasty, there's a very famous philosopher named Wang Chong. And Wang Chong says, sages take the whole world as their family without distinction between near or far, domestic or foreign. In their undertakings, the sages seek what is optimally appropriate. The most sagacious among us would family the whole world. This is the Confucian tradition. And so why do you have this? Because family is that human institution that for most of us is the centerpiece of our lives. I have the great honor of being a faculty member at Peking University, and I carry out my responsibilities the best I can. But if my family needed me, I would have to go home. If they need my money, I have to bring my money. If they need my kidney, I have to bring a kidney. That family is that human institution where we give utterly, we give everything that we've got. And so this idea of an optimizing harmony, 理之用和为贵, an optimizing harmony is the most valuable function of achieving propriety in our roles and relations. That this idea of li is directed at an optimizing symbiosis. And now, what does that mean? If we take the things that we know about China, if we take the menu in a Chinese restaurant, the menu is page after page after page of different ways of combining a finite number of ingredients, using the cheapest ingredient, vegetables, using minimally the most expensive ingredient, meat, in order to create a dish that then is eaten over noodles, is eaten over rice, is eaten over a kind of bread, bing. That the way of cooking to stir fry is to use the minimum amount of fuel and the maximum surface area of prepared vegetables in order to sear in the nutrients. And then when you go for a meal in a Chinese restaurant, you never go by yourself. You have to bring your friends, your colleagues. And so the concept of eating in this Confucian tradition that gives us food for thought is an optimizing symbiosis, trying to get the most out of your ingredients, trying to maximize what you can get out of your ingredients. Ping Ping mentioned that I translated the Sun Tzu Art of War. Even the art of war is not about making war. Sun Tzu Bingfa, the art of war, is bu de yi, that you only go to war as the last option, that war is always a losing proposition. War is a bad idea. Stay away from war. Do everything you can to avoid war. But if war happens, then how do you minimize the cost of war? How do you return as quickly as possible to a productive society? And so even warfare is this idea of optimizing symbiosis, getting the most out of your ingredients. So the other contribution this tradition has to make, in addition to a human-centered morality, in addition to a model of cultural transmission, is a human-centered, a family-centered religiousness that is not interested in claiming an exclusive truth. That religiousness in the Confucian tradition, in fact, if you ask most Chinese people, is the Confucian tradition religious? They would probably say no. But in fact, the Latin word for religion, religare, means to bind tightly, 绷得很紧, to bind tightly. And so one way of binding tightly, if Godhead is the residence of truth and beauty and goodness, then binding tightly means getting close to God. If meaning is what is available, truth and beauty and goodness reside within family, within the tradition itself, then binding is li. Binding is achieving propriety in one's roles and relationships. So the Chinese New Year is a phenomenon. It is the hugest human migration in the human experience. That tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people empty out from the cities and go home. And for 1 week, for 2 weeks, they go to their laojia, their old home, and they eat the food and they renew the relationships with family members and with teachers and with neighbors and so on, fortify themselves, and then come back to wherever they're working in order to carry on. And so a human-centered of religiousness there's no clergy except for the teachers and the elders. There's no altar except for the kitchen table. There's no no prescriptions except for the wisdom passed on in the Confucian classics. And so there's a different sense of religiousness, not an organized religion, but a sense of religiousness, a sense of spirituality that is centered on the family experience, that includes ancestors, that includes respect for our friends in history, our intellectual heroes that have come before. And so this alternative conception of religiousness is really an important contribution. Let me make two more points. I want to make sure that we have lots of time for discussion. And so let me make two more points, and then I'll bring this to a close. There's a philosopher of religion named James Carse, and he gives us a distinction between finite games and infinite games. Games are the things that human beings do. We do education, we do management, we do business, we play sports, we have international relations. So these are the games that human beings play. Finite games are really to be associated with individualism. Finite games are me and Ping Ping playing a game, a finite set of rules, a finite period of time, a winner and a loser. That is when we think of business, when we think of international relations, that way of thinking has really become a kind of default position. But infinite games is something very different. Infinite games has to do with my relationship with my granddaughter. I cultivate my relationship with my granddaughter because I want to help her address the pressing issues of the increasingly complex world in which we live. There's no beginning to the game, there's no end to the game. If we need to change the rules, we change the rules, but the goal is simply human flourishing. There's an interdependence between me and my granddaughter. There's a win-win or lose-lose model that is the alternative to the winners and losers that we find in finite games. And so in order to address these pressing issues of the time, this perfect storm that we're living in, global warming and pandemic and all the rest of it, we need to move from the ideology of individualism, whether it's individual people trying to get the most for themselves, whether it's individual corporations trying to get the most for themselves, whether it's sovereign states trying to get the most for themselves, to a recognition of our interdependence, to a recognition that if my neighbor does better, I do better, to a recognition that we as human beings have to recognize a family relationship in the things that we do. So to finish it up, Confucianism cannot solve all of our problems, but it should have a place at the table. That perhaps the most insidious problem that we have today, for me, and we can certainly talk about this, is the ideology of individualism. And there is nothing, if we want a concrete example of how this Confucian world addresses issues differently from a world that celebrates individual freedom, we simply have to look at the pandemic that we're facing today. Today in America, we had 120,000 new cases. We've had hundreds of thousands of deaths from the pandemic. This is true of Europe too, that this liberal idea of individualism contrasts with what has happened in East Asia. And it's not simply China. China, maybe 6,000 deaths. South Korea, 450. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, almost none. Japan, you know, that East Asia, these Confucian cultures, Vietnam, these Confucian cultures have really responded to the pandemic using the resources of this Confucian tradition, a recognition of our interdependence, a recognition that we either win together or we lose together, to address this problem, and have been able to contain it. In America, in Europe, we have failed. It's a runaway train. And so what I want to suggest is that the other issues, global warming, environmental degradation, massive species extinction, that all of these problems that we face today require resources that take us from the winners and losers model of individualism to the winners and winners model of infinite games. Thank you very much. Ping Ping, I'll rely on you to help me with the next stage in our meeting today. Or Ernst. I'm not hearing you.
Ping Ping, are you there? Roger, can you maybe close your screen sharing?
I can do that.
I don't know if that will make it easier for us to see if Ping Ping is back.
Yeah, Ping Ping seems to be frozen. These technologies are a challenge.
They are. So let me just jump in there briefly then and ask you, based on the last things you said, do you think we can have the best of both worlds? Can we have, you know, German engineering and Italian design in one? Can we have buses that are running on time like in Japan, but a warm-hearted, friendly Latin mentality? Can we have overcome individualism yet stay rights focused? Is that something? How do we design the best of several worlds?
No, I think your point is well taken. First off, what I would say is that I have this, like many Europeans, the idea of the European Union for me is really that kind of unity in diversity. You know, the idea to be German and European at the same time, to be French and European at the same time, to share these very different cultures and ways of being in the world. I mean, I think that kind of a goal is a very Confucian goal, the idea of human rights are entirely consistent with this idea of Confucianism. When I say the ideology of individualism, I really want to make a distinction between discrete individuality, discrete individuals, and individuality. Like this Confucian tradition, the notion of Ren, the basic value, the highest virtue of the tradition, is to achieve a kind of consummate virtuosity that is made possible not exclusive of your relationships with other people, but by virtue of the quality that you've been able to achieve in those relationships. And so, I mean, if you want to talk about leadership, you know, I mean, that's that kind of an idea. And so the uniqueness of the individual is celebrated, you know, but it's just that you're not, that you recognize that your identity is dependent upon the quality of your relationships with other people. And so in its time, individualism had its role, you know, when we think of liberating Europe, liberating the serfs from the aristocrats, when we think of minorities, when we think of gender issues, you know, that the value of each individual person has to be celebrated. Those aspects of individualism are hard won and very valuable, but it's behaving in a way where we think that if I get more for myself, it makes me better. You know, that my goal in life is to collect as much as I can for myself. A good bottle of wine drunk in a closet is not as much fun as sharing a good bottle of wine with a friend. You know, that, you know, our way of thinking needs to be expanded. That Confucianism has something to add to the world culture.
Yeah, we had a paper yesterday that was anchored on Ubuntu thinking, where the core notion is I am because you are. And yeah. I think a little about the difference, and I haven't thought it through yet, but the difference between I am because you are and I am so that you can be. And the Confucianism maybe leans a little towards the latter.
Very much so.
Yes, Ping Ping, sorry, you were frozen. I don't know if you're back. Can you, or I need to unmute you, I think. I don't know, let us check. Can you hear us then? You're unmuted, can you hear us? Ping Ping, you're muted again now. I'm asking you to unmute. And say something if you can, so that we know if you're back. You're somehow in with two profiles, Ping Ping. I don't know which is which, but I made both of them co-hosts now, so you should be able to control all muting and camera and screen sharing functions yourself.
Ernst, I'm getting some very good questions on the chat.
Yes, let's move to those.
Should I try to respond to some of those?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a question from Alam Beveridge. To everyone, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Could you comment if Taoism has a unique perspective to contribute as well? Very nice. For me, Confucianism, when I talk about rule, of course you have what in Chinese is called Ru Shi Dao. That is the Confucian, the Buddhist, and the Taoist. So you have these three different ways of thinking, but they're very different from the Abrahamic religions in the sense that with the Abrahamic religions, you can't be a Jew and a Christian and a Muslim all at the same time. You have to pick and choose. They're exclusive. And that exclusivity comes at a cost. With Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, they address different aspects in the complexity of the human being. Today, I'm giving a lecture, and I'm a Ru. This evening, when I close down my computer, I'm going to go have a glass of red wine and write a poem. I'm a Taoist. Tomorrow morning, when the dog dies, I'm going to send the dog on his way. I'm a Buddhist. That these in Chinese, you talk about san jiao wei yi, the three teachings as one, unity and diversity. That these are not competing traditions. These are traditions that each address a different aspect of the human experience. The Taoist tradition is very rich and very compelling, and we associate it with art and with music and with poetry and so on. We associate it with a kind of liberation that we don't have. Confucianism is about discipline, it's about self-cultivation and so on. The Zhuangzi is about xiao yao you. It's about free and easy wandering. It's about happiness and so on. That each of these traditions really have their own contribution to make to the human experience. Ping Ping says I'm here. There is Zhu Jiekai, who says, hello, Professor Ames. I wonder what we can do to let Western know more about the Chinese Oriental philosophy is quite an equal way. I mean, in quite a peaceful or not controversial way. I think what Zhe Kai is saying here is one of the problems, Ernst, that I'm sure you are dealing with in Europe. Certainly something that we're dealing with in America. Certainly something that is happening in Australia, and that is that there is a kind of anti-Chinese hysteria in the popular media, that we should be critical. China does lots of things wrong, but when the message is that everything is wrong, that's not being critical. And so then we ask the question, how did we get there? Why do we have this anti-China hysteria? I think one of the reasons was the power of Hegel. Hegel gave us an image of the Orient, of Oriental despotism that persists today, where there's only one ruler, and that's the emperor, and everybody else does what they're told without any kind of internal confirmation. They're hollow people. They just do as they're told. That image of China has persisted in the way in which China has been introduced into the Western academy, and with the absence of knowledge, and with the precipitous rise, China happened over a generation, but it really happened only over the last decade. And so all of a sudden, you have a economic and political power in the world that competes with Europe, that competes with America. And it has startled people. It has made people afraid. They see China's One Belt, One Road, Yidai Lu, Chang'e. They see this initiative of China, and they see it as a Chinese imperialism, having imperialistic histories themselves. They interpret it through their own lens. And so without being overly romantic about China, I think we really have to do our best to promote a more intelligent understanding of this ancient tradition. In 2013, at Sungkyunkwan University in Seoul, we established the World Consortium for Research in Confucian Cultures. There's not one Confucian culture. There's Korea, there's Japan, there's Vietnam, there's China. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to get past sort of the Chinatown of the world and look at Confucianism as a resource for a changing world cultural order. And so we've been working on doing exactly what Zhe Kai has suggested, and that is promoting a better understanding of this world. Now we have a question from Bo Yang.
Very good, Ping Ping, you're back. We can hear you now.
Bo Xiang just came with his phone and then put me on the phone. I don't know what my system did. I mean, I don't know why. Anyway, I switched to the computer, but it still does not work. Thank you very much, Professor Ames. Can you briefly explain the key difference between Confucianism and Western philosophies as a philosophy?
Sure.
It's a big question.
Yeah, I mean that's not a little question, Ping Ping.
I know, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I think that would help because a lot of people debate, you know, for Confucianism, is there a philosophy? Is there a religion? What is it?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I would say is that there's not a Western philosophy. That what happened was you had a kind of substance ontology, a Platonic tradition that persisted down to the last part of the 19th century. And then with Nietzsche's God is Dead, you had the rejection of foundationalism, of objectivism, of formalism, of all of the, of transcendentalism, of the pursuit of some kind of reality, some truth. And so the 20th century in Western philosophy, phenomenology, pragmatism, existentialism, hermeneutics, neo-Marxism, and so on, all of these traditions are moving in the same direction as Confucianism, trying to think process, reinstating wisdom, reinstating change as something that is real. And so the good news is that there is a convergence between Confucianism and where our best thinkers are taking us within the contemporary Western philosophical tradition. Confucianism contrasts very nicely with Aristotle and Plato, but Confucianism resonates very closely with Charles Taylor, with Mark Johnson, with our avatars, Michael Sandel, you know, the avatars of contemporary Western philosophy. But
thank you.
I've got these questions. Do you want me to ask the?
Sure.
Try to
Yes, please.
So I've got there's
yes.
a question from Bo Yang.
Yes.
Hello, Professor Ames. How do you think Confucian role ethics connects with leadership role ethics? If there is a connection between Confucian Junzi and leadership? Very nice question. Of course, the project in this Confucian world is to cultivate yourself and to grow yourself as a human being, to become a Junzi. Junzi is an exemplary person. You can only become a Junzi through social and political commitment, through participating in effecting social and political order. And so the Junzi, by definition, an exemplary person, is a leader, is a person that other people will defer to. So being an exemplary person for the Confucian is not a skill set. Like to be the best engineer, certainly you have to learn engineering, you have to know your math, you have to understand certain skills that go with being an engineer. But the most important engineer is somebody who can attract and who can coordinate all of the skills of a whole bunch of different people, unity and diversity, somebody whose character is such that everybody wants to work together with them to achieve a shared goal. And so the Confucian tradition is all about leadership. It's all about creating yourself as somebody who other people will defer to as a human being. From Damien Pyroskos, Thank you for your presentation. The today's world seems to be so much centered on individualism and its culture, prevalently Western. At the same time, Confucianism offers this unique perspective on relationships that, in my opinion, would help the world. Yet I can see that instead of the world follows the solutions offered by Confucianism, it is the Orient that becomes more individualistic. Don't you have this feeling? You've put your finger on a problem, Damien. And that is that when Zhe Kai asks, how do we get people to embrace Confucianism? How do we get them to understand it better? That problem is not simply a Western problem, it's also an Asian problem. That most young Chinese today celebrate the values. Most of my colleagues at Beida would describe themselves as liberals. They're interested in autonomy and human rights and liberalism. And so there is a sense in which, and if we go walk into a Chinese bookstore, everything that is Western has been translated into very good Chinese. That you name a name, a prominent Western intellectual, and he or she is there in the Chinese bookstore, in the Chinese library. And so there really is a sense in which modernization is Westernization. And I don't think there's anything wrong with Westernization. Ernst, human rights, absolutely central. Democracy, different kinds of democracy, very good idea. The idea of technologies that have come out of the Western scientific tradition, wonderful. So it's not, we don't want to disparage, the contribution that Western culture has made. My argument was what we want is 东西方化. We want East-West to be modernization. So my argument is that these Asian cultures that have arisen on the horizon, like the computer, have an important contribution to make to a changing world culture. And Damien, let me make another point, and that is that it's not that Western people are going to read my books and fall in love with Confucianism. My argument would be that necessity itself is going to mean that we're going to have to pay attention to Asia. With the pandemic, if these Western leaders, political leaders, would simply look at Asia and say, those people figured out how to stop the virus. Let's follow them. Let's do what they've done and stop that problem within our own culture. So necessity itself, somebody will wake up and say, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, that Wuhan is opened up, that the Chinese economy is flourishing, that China is back in business because they handled the pandemic in a way that comes out of their Confucian tradition. We might not understand Confucianism. Let's use their way of going about solving the pandemic, and maybe we should learn a bit more about Confucian while we're doing so. So I think necessity will recommend this Confucian worldview to a world in crisis, a world that is facing a perfect storm. I don't have your name.
Yeah, there's no name there.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, must be a colleague here in the university. Yeah,
Okay.
The question is on school again, on philosophy. Why there are only 2 left out of 100 in the spring-autumn dynasty?
Oh, very nice question. And it has to do with hybridity, 混合性. When you move from the pre-Qin period of the 100 schools into the Han Dynasty and Rushui becomes the state ideology, what you have is you have a Rushui that has ingested all of the schools that would compete with it. when you look at Xunzi, Xunzi has Mozi with Zheng Ming, has Ming Jia, he has Bing Fa. You know, he has that the kind of Confucianism that emerges in the Han Dynasty is a fortified Confucianism that that has drawn into itself the different elements that would compete with it. Taoism has been drawn into it with a text like the Zhongyong. You know, the Analects of Confucius is focused on the human experience. The Taoism comes along and says, think cosmically, think in terms of the cosmos. And so then you have the Zhongyong. The Zhongyong appears, and the Zhongyong is all about Ren Neng Pei Tian. The human being can be a partner with the heavens, that the human being can be a co-creator with the heaven and the earth, you know? And so, the whole point is that Tang Juni, with your unity and diversity, let me give you one term that summarizes this Confucian tradition, and that idea, that postulate is yi duo bufan, the inseparability of one and many. Many are one, one are many. This is Tang Juni. That Tang Juni talks about how when you talk about a person, an individual person, a person is one and many at the same time. I'm both me and my relationships with other people. Rudyard Kipling, what knows he of England whom only England knows? That we can only know ourselves by understanding our context. And so the idea of contextualism, of understanding things by virtue of their relationship to their context, is the basic premise of this Confucian tradition. Unity and diversity, 和而不同, you know, is the fundamental value in the tradition. And so that's what happens. The Confucianism becomes a representative of many different traditions.
Okay, all right. I have another student here, and he wants to ask you the relationship between, among the four dimensions in the Analects, right? 至于道，居于人，依于德，由于人，由于义。至于道，基于德，依于人，由于义。And he wanted to know the relationship among the four. Basically, these are four different behaviors that Confucius asked his disciples. I forgot which chapter, but there's 至于道，居于德，依于人，由于义. Do you recall?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And what these terms describe is the basic condition of a human being. Like, when you're born into the world, you're not an individual. That your narrative begins nested in the narratives of your family. You're born into a mature culture. You don't invent the language speaks you as much as you speak the language. And so these different, you know, this 任意理智 is a description of the conditions that are defining of a human being, that you're born into a family, and so you have a certain role in the family. You're born with people loving you and teaching you how, by being loved, you can love other people. You're born into a world that is organized around family relationships and certain kinds of practices. You're born into a world that has wisdom. You're born into a world that has values and music and culture, and so these basic values are what are celebrated by the Confucian tradition.
Okay. All right. There's another new question, Professor Ames. He's Professor Chu from Tsinghua University. He's part of the China chapter.
Right.
Also part of, my collaborator on the project, Humanistic. Yes. He has a question for you.
Hi, Professor Ames. I am Qing. My question is, what can the world benefit most from the thought of Chinese sages? In other words, what is the core idea of Chinese sages' thought that can make the greatest contribution to the development of the world? That's the question that's the most important question that I wanted to address today. And as I said with Ernst, that Confucianism's most important contribution today is an alternative conception of person to the notion of individual. And so I've got a new book out. It'll be out in December. It's called Human Beings, Human Becomings. That the Confucian tradition is not about a human being. When we look at Aristotle isolates the human being as a subject. When we look at the Analects of Confucius, Confucius says, "Ji yu li," or li ren, that in wanting to establish yourself, you establish other people. And so the Confucian tradition is human becoming. It's a project. It's something that we do in our roles and relationships with other people. And so I think the most important contribution that Confucianism has to offer is an alternative to an ideology of individualism, that we have to stop thinking as separate units. We have to recognize our interdependence and we have to embrace it. We have to give it value. So that's the most important. Also, we have to get back to family, which is really the basic metaphor. Of the Confucian tradition. So very nice question, Jing.
Okay, there's no more question from the audience, but I would like to ask you to, give more general suggestions on people who are among the audience. I can see many different nationalities. Like if they wanted to know more about Confucianism, what kind of works or books that you would recommend, and how could they learn more about Confucianism and how they should interpret that? Because there are many different religions, religious people. There are also people who call themselves, even Christians, call themselves Confucian Christian or Confucian Islams. So I would like to ask you to explain a little bit and then see, in general terms, how can people in different or who have different religious beliefs to be open and learn more about Confucianism to their benefit.
Yeah, I would, one of the texts that we translated into English is called The Chinese Classic of Family Reverence. And it's all about family. It's something that everybody can identify with. And so in the text itself is very short. Maybe it's the last 10 pages. But the introduction to it really tries to make the argument that this way of thinking about being in the world is has value. And so for me, the Xiao Jing would be the, it's very accessible. It celebrates the most important values of the tradition. It locates the human experience within the cosmos. It identifies human values with cosmic values. When we plant a root and grow, that way of thinking is the way the world works, the way that the garden works. It's the way the cosmos works. Is growth, is life, is the positive dividends that we achieve when we grow things. In this tradition, there is a coincidence between education and morality. Education is all about growing yourself. Morality is all about growing yourself. And so education is always moral education, that you educate yourself in order to become a junzi, in order to become an exemplary person. Why do you want to be a moral person? In order to be a moral person. Why do you want to be educated? In order to be an educated person. So the tradition really does go back to this idea of setting the root, 扎根, and 生长, growth, growth in relationships.
Done? All right. There's another question.
Oh, here we are. Yep.
Okay.
Adam Smith wrote that people have two attitudes. They either concentrate on relationships, family and friends, or on actions, get things done, best suited for the market-like relationships. Does Confucianism have the same kind of perspective on the way people act, or does it concentrate on relationships only? I mean, Adam Smith is probably one of the most misunderstood philosophers that we have. He writes a book called Wealth of Nations, The Invisible Hand, the Marketplace, and so on. But Adam Smith also writes a book called Moral Sentiments. And for Adam Smith, economics and morality are not separate. They come together, you know, that these two things have to be understood together. And that is very, very Confucian. I think that that in the Confucian tradition, a relationship is an action. That relationships are what we do. That when you ask the question, what is a relationship? A relationship is a relating to. It's giving an account of. It's a conversation. And so this kind of relation-centered world is getting something done. Like what is it that we want to do? What we want to do is we want to live happy lives. We want to flourish as human beings. What actions are more important than paying attention to the relationships that we have with other people? One of the greatest faults that we have as human beings is taking other people for granted, for not paying attention, for not listening to other people, for not caring about them, for not stopping and trying to help, being too busy. And so I think that the most important actions that define us as human beings are serving the relationships that give us context in the world, that locate us within the world. Very nice question, Damien.
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
I want you to explain the key differences between East and West in terms of their interpretation of humanism. I'm sorry, another big one.
Yeah, these are rather large questions. It depends on what we mean by humanism. I mean, humanism within the Western tradition is associated with a struggle against a kind of oppressive religiousness. It's an assertion of human value independent of the church in some way. And so it entails a certain kind of curriculum. So there is a kind of formal humanism within the Western philosophical tradition. But humanistic studies broadly, they're celebrating the capacity and the responsibility of the human being. It belongs to both of these worlds. what would be the I think the difference would be a matter of emphasis. I think that in the East Asian traditions, the emphasis is upon relationships. It's upon cultivating yourself through your roles and relationships with other people. I think maybe the focus of humanism within a European and American world might be more centered on the individual, might be more centered on personal articulation, on achieving a certain kind of personal identity. And so I mean, my argument would be that individualism comes at a cost, you know, that you have to give up something in order to have the freedom that comes along with a radical conception of individualism. So I would say that East Asian humanism is more aesthetic in the sense that everything counts for anything, that it's holistic, that everything is included in trying to find the best way forward. Whereas the Enlightenment West tends to be more rationalistic, tends to give high value to rational technologies, to a kind of homogeneity, a kind of, and I would say another another very important difference would be the difference between this idea of optimizing symbiosis, 综合, and Western teleology, the linearity of Western culture, the teleology, the idea that there is some kind of purpose, some kind of grand design, that there is some kind of deity that has laid out a path for the human being. That's not there in the East Asian tradition. You don't have a transcendent, self-sufficient, independent God. That gods are dead people, gods are ancestors, gods are cultural heroes like Confucius. That you have a different understanding of the concept of God. And so Western culture tends to be rationalized. It tends to be linear. It tends to move from darkness to light, from class struggle to millenarian society, from Asia to absolute spirit in Hegel, from creation to judgment day in Christianity. There's a linearity to it, whereas the East Asian focus is much more on here and now. You're not living this life in order to get somewhere else. You're living this life to enjoy this life. In Western culture, very often we're directed towards some kind of future. It's salvific, it's eschatological. There's salvation somehow. There's something to be accomplished. Whereas in the Asian context, family is an accomplishment. Flourishing family is the most important accomplishment. So we've got some more questions.
Thank you.
Here.
I know. Thank you. Sorry, it's getting late for you. Yeah, there are two more. Oh, one more.
What do you think is the role, purpose of relationships in our lives versus the karma that we're here to do? Because what in the end fulfills us is our karma working towards our purpose. What's your take on that? Yeah, I think karma is a very sophisticated idea. Like a lot of people have a very simple-minded understanding of karma, that karma means that if you do good things, you get rewards, and if you do bad things, you get punished. But I think karma is precisely what you're describing, Supriya, and that is that karma is our capacity to change direction and to affect the world in a positive way. And so the purpose of the relationships in our lives are a product in themselves. Like I think that's the point. At the end of the day, I had the word appreciate is a very interesting word in the English language. If I appreciate Ping Ping, that means that I recognize her magnificence, her value. If I appreciate her, that means that I'm responsive to her needs. If I appreciate her, it means that more value is created. Like if I say, last year my house appreciated by $50,000, that appreciation creates value. And so the way that the purpose that we have, the roles that we live are our purposes. To be a good teacher, to be a good husband, to be a good grandfather is my purpose in life. I certainly have my work, but my work goes along with that. Like the work that I do and the person that I am is the same thing. My narrative is who I am. And so that's my role, is the teacher, the father, the grandfather. And so we have another question from Ruth Elizabeth Slater. Thank you, Professor Ames, for your presentation. I've been hooked, even though it is miserably early in the UK. I am interested in something you said about leadership not being a skill set, and yet how many business schools in the West look to develop manager and leadership skill sets or competencies. So many, and furthermore, we welcome many foreign students to the UK who appear to be seeking a kind of leadership education, which is perhaps not necessary, a different approach. Why? When the tenets of Confucianism say everything, I wonder if you could speak to this. Yeah, I think, Ruth, I think one really important distinction that we need to make is the distinction between education and training. Education is who we are, who we become. It has to do with our values. It has to do with our interests. It has to do with music and poetry. It has to do with intelligent conversation. It has to do with empathy for other people. It has to do with celebrating the culture, the mature cultures in which we live. Training is, if you join a bank and the bank wants you to do a certain job, the bank will train you how to do that job. Education is not about training. It's about who we become as people. And so, you know, that's the difference between, and the secret here is that the person who's going to become the manager in the bank, the person who's going to exercise real leadership in the bank, is the person who has cultivated themselves as a person, who has become educated in the proper sense of education, and who is able to handle the competencies, the skill set, but who can rely on other people, whose leadership inspires other people to contribute their very best skills to the job at hand. And so, so leadership is really about education as opposed to training. I think that might be a distinction that we could make.
I know it's getting late for you. I want to ask, maybe I'll let you go a little, I mean, a few minutes earlier, but I want to ask a tiny question and the last question.
Okay.
Would it be fair to lump the US or American side to the Europe, or there's the Europe, when we say humanism? Can we just like contrast the East and West without breaking the American side from the European side? Would it be okay to just refer them generally as West? Because
hmm.
yeah,
I-
the 启蒙运动, it's only in the Europe. The word just escaped me. The Renaissance period, the Renaissance,
Sure.
they're all in Europe. So
Yeah.
can we just, yeah.
No, I don't. I think that these are very different worlds. I mean, I love Europe. When you walk around in Vienna or Barcelona or Berlin, the architecture, the ambient, it's like having art around you, that there's a depth of culture in the European world that simply isn't there in America. America, strip malls and, America is fast, and it's innovative because it's not burdened by the responsibility of a persistent cultural identity in the way in which European cultures are. And so there's a trade-off. The other thing that I would say is that being an American is all about being an immigrant. And that it's only in the old days that Americans were European, that California is more non-European than European. I grew up in Canada, and the difference between Canada and America is that Americans think they have an identity. In Canada, most of our parents speak with an accent, that they are such recent immigrants that they have an accent. So I think that I think the language of East and West is not helpful. Li Ziho talks about an inside without an outside. That we ought to be talking about not international relations, where you're putting two things together, but intranational relations, where we recognize that we're organically interrelated. And then the question becomes, what are we going to do about the relationship? That we are a family. We're a family of cultures. We're a family of philosophical ideas. There's only one philosophy, and that is to draw upon as many different philosophies as one can in trying to think through particular issues. And so for me, what I've been trying to do for a lifetime is to say, let's stop using geographical criteria to make decisions about what is philosophical. Let's use philosophical criteria. If you compare Confucius and Kant, that's comparative philosophy. If you compare Dewey and Kant, that's philosophy. It's all philosophy. And so we have to get away from celebrating the limitations of our purview, our philosophical purview.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to keep you up so late.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we have over back and then in and out should be over 100 people benefited from your staying up for us. So we look forward to reading your new book. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll sell some books, Ping Ping.
Sure.
I look forward to seeing you.
Thank
look forward to seeing you in China.
Sure. We'll visit you. All right. Good night. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ernst. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this opening session of the last day of our Humanistic Management Conference. What we're doing now is we're taking a bit of an extended break because we had this session quite early so that Professor Ames could join us from Hawaii, I believe he is, and that you, especially in China, could join us as well. And so this was the best timing for everyone to be able to come in. And we will start in an hour and a half, a little over an hour and a half, 11 a.m. European time. with a contribution from the UK chapter on leadership in crises. So that will be a fantastic discussion among the scholars in our UK chapter. And I very much hope to welcome all of you back. Until then, we will take a break. So relax, eat something, do what you enjoy, re-energize for the rest of the conference day. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernst. Thank you.